Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Bletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn from their diverse stories, experiences, and get their insights. If you would like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. Thank you to TR Sun for their song All Good on today's episode. If you would like to follow along, or if you're like me and seeing the lyrics make listening to music more accessible to you, then check out the link in the podcast description for this episode. Now, on today's episode, Dr. Megan Neff joins us to discuss her Autistic Burnout Workbook. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Dr. Neff, thanks so much for joining me here on Autism Stories.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And I'd love to start off our conversation by learning where your story in the autistic community begins.
And it's interesting I'm tempted to say it starts in 2021, but in some ways it actually starts back in 2016. Well, so I often say 2021 because that's when I discovered first that my daughter was autistic and then that I was. But I think my story really starts in 2016 because it was the first time I looked at something that suggested autism. And I was in my training to become a psychologist, and we take a class pretty early on assessments. And so we first do all the assessments on ourselves to learn how to do them on others. And sometimes there's like standardized reports that get printed out. So as part of that, I'm looking at a printout of one of the standardized reports from a personality assessment I did, and it suggests I should look into autism. And I look at that and I just outright dismissed it. And I think that feels like an important part of my story. And it has some shame around it, actually, because there's a few things that bubbled up for me in that moment. One was ableism, because the idea of thinking about myself as autistic brought on some discomfort and some shame, but also just how entrenched I was in the stereotypes of autism. Even as someone becoming a psychologist, I thought there's no way I can be autistic. I'm like deeply empathetic. I'm relational. I like deep encounters with people. So it also just speaks to how entrenched I was in kind of the cultural archetypes we have that made it hard to see myself as autistic. In some ways, I feel like that's where my story starts, is with me seeing it in front of me and saying, no, thank you. And no, I don't see myself reflected in that.
It's really interesting because, we're going to talk about your wonderful workbook. Thinking back to 2016, that wasn't that long ago. So to go from a point of shame to be able to provide a resource now in 2025 that I think is going to impact so many autistic people in our lives, kind of how does that process happen in a way so quickly? Maybe it doesn't feel so quickly to you, but really when we're thinking about time, that's less than 9 years.
It is less than 9 years, and it's a huge pivot. And I think that's a great question. And I think it kind of speaks to the autistic way, like our passion and our all or nothing. So yeah, I went from not entertaining that to, fast forward 5 years later, it becomes evident that this is something worth considering for one of our kids. But it was also that push and pull of we didn't pursue it earlier when we probably should have, because she was a girl and because of all those stereotypes I had in mind. But when I did consider it, then I went all in. So then I was learning about, my entry point was learning about autistic girls, autistic women. Also, as part of my training to become a psychologist, I've been doing a lot of depth psychology. And I had unearthed so many questions about my experience, about why I felt like I was living my life behind plexiglass, why I couldn't connect relationally in the ways that I wanted to, just why my life felt so fragmented and alienated. And then I discover autism, first for my daughter and then myself, and everything clicks into place. All of a sudden, I go from having a very fragmented sense of self, fragmented history, to oh my goodness, like I make sense, my body makes sense, my life makes sense. And so this lens became very powerful. So autism both became a special interest, but also just an incredibly empowering lens and healing lens to have for myself. So then, yeah, I did a really sharp pivot. I began, my clinical training was more in like health psychology, and then it pivoted toward like neurodivergence and autism and ADHD, and you're right, made a lot of resources in the last several years. It was so life-changing for me. And I think that's why the pivot was so deep and so fast and so intense.
Now, this past month, your comprehensive workbook, the Autistic Burnout Workbook, was released. The workbook has, lots of insightful visuals and transformative exercise to help people process their feelings and re-energize their lives. So I'm just wondering, from like a personal perspective, are there any visuals and exercises these days that are particularly meaningful to you?
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, it is very visual. I'm a visual thinker, and that's kind of how I metabolize things. So there's a lot in there that I feel attached or connected to, but I think that I'm perhaps most excited about or attaches in the sensory chapter. Really, again, because that was such a big thing for me is yeah, so I'm mostly hypersensitive. So my body's often very overwhelmed by the too muchness of the world. And again, I didn't have a understanding of that until 37. So I was pretty disconnected from my body. So a huge part of my early discovery and then in building a life that's more resilient to burnout has been in understanding my sensory profile, getting to know what actually works for my sensory system, what soothes it, what comforts it, what triggers it. So in the sensory chapter, there's a lot of sensory checklists. And I find that helpful because I don't know about you, but I've got alexithymia, so difficulty like identifying emotions and experiences. So if you're like, what are your sensory preferences? I'm probably gonna be like, I mean, now I could answer it, but before I'd be like, I don't know. But so having a checklist I think is really helpful. So I like the sensory checklists that are in there, as well as diagrams in there, as well as in this chapter on spoon theory and energy management. It's trying to help people get to understand their energy rhythms so that they can then kind of sync life tasks with their energy rhythms. So I also, I guess I'm drawn to those diagrams because I think learning what our energy rhythms is and then working in flow with them versus in friction with them, I think that's really important for burnout resilience. So those would be some I would highlight.
I'm alexithymic as well. And it's been interesting these last couple of years, kind of digging into that a little bit deeper. And kind of one of the things that I've realized is that, like, I've always been drawn. I mean, this isn't an unusual thing in any way. I've been drawn to music, and I realize that certain songs come up for me when I'm processing certain emotions. And that's why I listen to them over and over again. And then I just move on to something else.
I'm smiling over here because I do the exact same thing. Like I used to feel kind of guilty about it because would feel like I would need like these extra supports to get into my feelings. But now I understand it. And it absolutely, if I'm maybe feeling like a shadow of an emotion, I might go find a song that will like draw that emotion out so that I can get into that experience a bit more. So I love that you mentioned that. I absolutely do the same thing, and it's been helpful for me.
Now, I feel that when I'm in autistic burnout, one of the obvious signs for me is my sleep quality is decreasing. I always think about sleep, and bad sleep ruins everything. So,
Yeah.
what might be some things for us as autistic people to do to promote better quality sleep on as much of a consistent basis as possible?
So and this is where I think things get really tricky is so autistic burnout is describing an experience that a lot of us have. It's a big umbrella term, but that doesn't mean there aren't other experiences in the mix. For example, and this is something I was trying to tease out this fall because I have long COVID, and when I get a COVID reinfection, it's like for 4 months, like I have terrible 4 to 5 months of terrible brain fog, terrible fatigue. So I was working on my sleep and looking into chronic fatigue syndrome. which is something I've wondered about the last 10 years because of fatigue. And for example, just to take an example, in the context of chronic fatigue syndrome, that can impact some of our brain regions that regulate, so like the hypothalamus that regulate our sleep wake cycle. So one of the things that's really brutal about CFS is you'll be so tired, but then it'll interrupt sleep. And so you can't get good sleep. Now, when I think about autistic burnout, if it's just autistic burnout, I actually think the person's probably going to be sleeping pretty decently. So if someone's in autistic burnout and having sleep issues, I think my first thought is to rule out other medical things. We also know that autistic people are more prone to all sorts of sleep disorders. So insomnia, but also things like sleep apnea, restless leg syndrome. So, and this is where I think of kind of the autistic burnout piece is knowing your vulnerabilities and your drivers. And for a lot of us have sleep vulnerabilities. So first of all would be figuring out, is there a medical reason that I'm having difficulty with sleep? And once that's sorted, then we can start talking about like behavioral and sensory supports and habit supports that we can bake in that's also going to support our sleep.
Now, from what I understand, the intersection of spirituality and psychology is something you've been drawn to, which I love. How do you look at spirituality, maybe in terms of managing burnout?
I when I think about spirituality, part of it is tapping into these kind of bigger level experiences like awe, transcendence, meaning, our values. And whenever we're living in alignment with those things, that is deeply replenishing, it's energizing, it's life giving. When we aren't living in alignment with those things, it is depleting, it is exhausting, it is creating friction. So the more we can live in alignment with, you know, transcendence, awe, values, some if we have a spiritual practice or spiritual practice, that is a very replenishing resource for us.
I love the word alignment. When we're not in alignment, I feel like a lot of times the energy that we use so much energy. And
Mhm.
I definitely see that connection with burnout.
Yeah, yeah. Like if we think about burnout and like kind of an energy equation, just not being in alignment. And we could say this for so many things, like not being in alignment with our sensory system. If we're in environments that are chronically in misalignment with our system, that's going to be grating on our nervous system. If we're not in alignment with our values or our spiritual practice, that in like in a very kind of deep psychological way is going to be energy depleting. Yeah.
Now, I read that you are a writer turned accidental Instagrammer. That makes me think about
Mhm.
the impact of social media potentially on autistic burnout. How do you look at social media in that aspect in 2025?
Well, I'd be curious to your thoughts on that, but I look at it with a lot of nuance and complexity. I don't think social media is good or bad. I do think we want to be very mindful of it, and it's easy to get pulled in. I mean, the the algorithms are literally designed to pull us in a way that does not support us being mindful around its use. And then especially if we're autistic and ADHD, we're more susceptible to some of that. I would say it's mixed, and that the biggest thing is to be mindful. And here's why I say it's mixed is autistic community and connection and culture, like so much of that is being built on social media. So many people are learning about themselves. They're hearing about lived experience of other people. They're hearing about things like autistic burnout for the first time. And it's like, oh my gosh, there's a name for this. And so it can be so, so powerful. It also can be very energy depleting. And so I think a lot of it goes back to that, like, can we check in with ourselves when we're using it? Like pause when you're scrolling of like, what's happening? Like, and again, this is going to be a bit harder with alexithymia, but like, what is my nervous system doing right now? Am I getting pulled into, maybe I even agree with this content, but I'm getting pulled into like a fight flight energy. And so really paying attention to that, maybe doing, I kind of like to think about it as doing occasional digital detox just to get a baseline. And then to pay attention to, okay, this content, not just do I like it or agree with it, but this is how it settles when I see it. Is this content I want to keep seeing or not? Um, and then be mindful of things like social comparison, like platforms like that just can generate a lot of social comparison, which can be, again, very depleting, very energy costly, and just not good for our like psychology and mindset. So, yeah, not good or bad. It can be both. And I think the big thing is having mindfulness and awareness around how it's impacting us.
Now, I think as autistic people, learning about autistic burnout is so critical and how to manage that. However, I also think about our loved ones and our support systems learning about autistic burnout. What are some things that our support systems can do to help us manage and navigate burnout?
So burnout is like, this is a word that's now in the culture. We use it a lot. And I think when autistic people are describing autistic burnout, they're typically describing something much more pervasive and disabling than allistic burnout. So part of it is being able to communicate like the severity of the impact. And sometimes metaphors, I think, can be powerful for that. So the first thing is being able to communicate about like, here's what's happening, here's my true capacity. And it can be really confusing for us and for the people around us. And then I think the ways that people close to us can support us, I think, first of all, just understanding so that if we are withdrawing, that's not necessarily a bad thing, that maybe that's, there's this term called strategic withdrawal. Withdrawal in psychology is often talked about as being a bit maladaptive because, like, when we're depressed or anxious or have PTSD, people will often withdraw. And it's a sign that the mental health condition is worsening. But with burnout, an autistic person might strategically withdraw to resource themselves. So I think for one is the people around them knowing that and that being okay. And then sensory stuff, like, are there things we can do to make the environment more like less sensory aggravating, more sensory friendly? Are there ways, especially if we're partnered, are there ways that for a time can we reallocate kind of domestic demands? And is there a way that we can take a little bit off your plate if the other person's in a space to be able to do that? Can we outsource some of this stuff? I think so much of it goes back to that, like a deep understanding of this is not just someone being tired and needing a good night's sleep and they can bounce back, but that this is a pretty significant thing.
And lastly, how can our listeners learn more about you and the Autistic Burnout Workbook and purchase a copy for themselves or a loved one?
Yeah, so it's available at all major store outlets. So both online and in like traditional bookstores, or you can learn more by going to neurodivergentinsights.com. We've got information on there. There's also I don't know if clinicians listen to this, but the publisher does offer discounts for bulk orders of 10 books or more. And I can share a link with you that you could share on where to get information on all of that. But if they just want to connect with my work in general, neurodivergentinsights.com, we've got a lot of resources up there, including a lot of articles on burnout and sleep and nervous system and sensory and kind of all these things we've been talking about. Energy, like pacing energy systems. So that would be one. And then also I co-host Divergent Conversations, where we also talk about things like burnout and neurodivergent identity and all of these themes as well.
Whatever platform it is for you, whether it's on social media or through the Autistic Burnout Workbook or through this podcast interview, or as well as your podcast, you always provide tremendous insight. It's wonderful. And so I strongly encourage people to follow you on social media, and please purchase the Autistic Burnout Workbook because it's the most comprehensive workbook I have seen on autistic burnout. And I think it's going to be incredibly helpful for so many others. So thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks so much for having this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Dr. Neff for the conversation. To learn more about Dr. Neff and the Autistic Burnout Workbook, please check out the links in the podcast description for this episode. We always love hearing from you and would especially love to hear from you relating to this episode regarding how do you manage burnout and replenish your energy. Did you know Autism Personal Coach provides neurodiversity affirming support by autistics for autistics? We empower autistic adults and teens to be the best version of their authentic selves through customized life coaching and community groups. We also support parents and partners of autistic individuals by providing insights and guidance to bridge communication gaps and nurture mutual understanding. So please visit autismpersonalcoach.com to begin your experience of judgment free coaching rooted in empathy, expertise, and respect for autistic identity. Until next time, I'm Doug Bletcher of Autism Personal Coach. Talk to you then.